Hello, team. Welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War Kursk update for the 15th of August 2024. My time, I'm in a different time zone being on holiday at the moment. So I don't know whether you are in the same day as me or not. Who knows? Anyway, we're going to start with looking at a few bits and pieces that I've already discussed in my first video today, just because they're relevant to Kursk and we need to make sure we're covering everything. So loads of evacuations, including 300 passengers from Belgrade. So it could be the Russians are clearing out, evacuating areas of Belgrade because they're afraid of another attack across the border along from the Kursk invasion, maybe back into where the Russians themselves are attacking into Kharkiv. It could be there's either a pushback there or further to the northwest, along towards the Kursk border, where the Ukrainians might be planning on pushing back, or at least the Russians are thinking the Ukrainians could do that. There's a long thread I went through on how refuseniks and people who are too injured or old or whatever to go to war that are being held in a detention center near St. Petersburg have been basically shoved in a bunch of trucks and sent off to Kursk, a group of 300, a group of 150. This shows that the Russians are desperate. They arguably don't have the reserves to support the Kursk defense. So pulling from certain areas of the front line, but not wanting to pull from areas where they're having success, like in Pokrovsk, although the Ukrainians are being pushed back maybe to their much more formalized fortifications. So it's not all bad. You know, the whole process there is just ceding territory until they get to their fortifications. Nonetheless, the Russians are not drawing from those areas around Toretsk and New York. That's where it's going fairly badly, because those aren't areas where there are fortifications. They weren't expecting to be attacked there. But they are taken from other places along the front line, and they are indeed seeming to take troops from places like Kaliningrad, the exclave on the Baltic Sea, and also, as you can see here, from refuseniks, and just sending them to the front line. Now, some of those have gone missing. In here, there was a claim that 20 of them had got out the trucks or whatever and run off, and they didn't bother chasing them. There's also a claim that 42 conscripts have gone missing near in Kursk itself. They've gone AWOL, so there are deserters. And I also talked, and I could show you the footage. There's just incredible amounts of POW footage of just huge swathes of Russian POWs taken in the Kursk region. There's a claim that 170 were taken today or yesterday. I'm not quite sure what the time frame was on that. Other days, 100 a day. To the point where there are claims that now 2,000 Russian POWs have been taken. And if that is a case, that is a serious amount of people, and that will help the Ukrainians fill up their exchange fund to be able to take that to the Russians. Here we go. One Russian colonel told The Independent that as many as 2,000 Ukrainian colonel, Russian soldiers have been taken captive in the Kursk region. There's just so much footage coming out. I could show you that. I could show you these just whole lines and lines and lines of people. There's a whole sort of hangar tunnel with people lined up either side. I've seen road footage from a drone of literally like hundreds. There was the Ukrainian SBU A group, so these are special forces, apparently took 102 prisoners, and they were Chechens and Russians, so Akhmat and Russian soldiers. And we're hearing 170 from today or yesterday, over 100 a day often, up to the point that 2,000 have been taken, and there are now rumours of an all for an all swap of prisoners. So this has been one of the biggest successes, I think, of the Kursk invasion, that they are just taking that many prisoners. And I was sort of talking about how there are many conscripts active in that front line, and these are younger people who probably have greater access to information through social media to understand that they're not going to be tortured to death, which is a prevailing propaganda, and it's why people try and kill themselves rather than be taken prisoner. So we're seeing many more people just saying, right, I'm being conscripts as well, not contracted soldiers or veterans who have come back to volunteer or whatever. These are people who are just going through the conscription, now being sent to the front line saying, hey, okay, I'm not up for this. But then there are still people who there was a testimony that I shared this morning of someone who said, I thought we were going to be tortured till I died. So, and he was a conscript. He said, me and my mate were injured, so we threw ourselves on a hand grenade. Turns out it didn't kill them. And then they were rescued by Ukrainians and given medical aid and then brought back. And then he was saying, "I wish I I wish I'd known that. We were told that we would just. It is better to commit suicide than to be captured." So there are these still these prevailing propaganda ideas from the Russians that the Russian soldiers should kill themselves rather than be captured. Right, Ukraine has opened a hotline for Russian citizens in Kursk who wish to receive humanitarian aid and want to be evacuated to Ukraine amid ongoing fighting in the area. So that's good news. We've also heard that the Russian regions have been hit by railway collapse, not just because Sudzha and places are being captured, and these are important railway routes, and so physically disrupted, but also because they've been prioritizing trains for evacuations and for troops, and that has led to bottlenecks, and there's not enough drivers, there's not enough maintenance, there's not enough repair, and there are not enough locomotives. So there's an interesting thread here by Prune 60 that goes into detail of the nightmare that's going, actually stretching all the way from Belarus. So rail traffic from Belarus to Russia is badly affected by the attack into Kursk. So there's lots of other, you could argue, strategic reasons or operationally important objectives for this attack that isn't just kind of land. It's what this land is and what the effect of taking this land might be. You've got PR, you've got logistics, you've got intel. All of this stuff will be important for the Ukrainians here. Russian Telegram channels also reported the search of abandoned or damaged vehicles of the Ukrainians, that inside them have been backpacks containing Russian uniforms. There's also been a claim that a village was taken by Ukrainians, but because they dressed up with captured Russian uniform and then put on blue armbands and said, "Right, now we're in control." So this is, as I mentioned earlier, this is actually perfidy. You're not supposed to do this. However, I mean, we've seen many films of this happening, and don't think twice about it. You think it's quite a clever tactic, but it is perfidy. So it is technically against the rules of war. I don't know how you feel about that. Both sides have been doing that throughout this war in other contexts, of the front line, and apparently it's happening up in Kursk as well. Right. Don't forget that it's all very challenging in Donbass, as mentioned. So lots of people sort of pointing that out online, that don't forget Donbass. Okay. But just concentrating on Kursk, let's look at a couple of maps of the area as according to Suryak Maps. Is a pro-Russian mapper. So we had this. There's a lot of talk about Koronovo, this town up here, and they're attacking into there, but also going south. There was talk yesterday of fighting in Koronovo. Different claims to what's going on there, but there are also claims that further to the south they could be trying to bypass Koronovo, and also possibly going a little bit to the north, and then further nearer to the border here, an area of land that the Ukrainians have taken there, and then trying to take more and more of Sudzha and move west to, east to Belitsia. So this is actually now under control of the Ukrainians, as according to Suryak Maps, which is, yesterday we were looking at that on Andrew Perpetua's map, and that was grey zone. It'll be interesting to see where it is now. So he updated this an hour ago. Goodness me, look at everything that's going on around there. What are these new icons? Mandatory evacuation. So lots of evacuation around here. We do have an increase of control. As you can see, this light blue area all the way up there shows that this is what the Ukrainians have achieved since yesterday, since I last did the update, and one here over on the west. So the Ukrainians are attacking in these kind of blue arrow directions, and up there as well. The Russians are trying to retake, and there were claims that they retook Martinovka, which is just here. So claims that the Russians are retaking that, and then counterclaims to that, but there certainly seem to be pressuring there, and maybe grey zone on the eastern side of Sudzha, but many claims now exist that the Ukrainians just are fully in control of Sudzha. Anyway, that was Suryak Maps claims yesterday. Then when we look at their claims today, you can see that they reckon that the Russians have, or he reckons that the Russians have taken back some of that area around Belitsia. So this area there is now back under Russian control. but the Ukrainians are having some success around north of Sudzha and going up here towards Martinovka. So this is a kind of area that Andrew Perpetua has the Russians pushing in. This is where we're talking about on that Suriyat map up here. Okay, that's a bit of the mapping done. Let's look at some other claims. So Syrskyi said that they've gone 35 kilometers deep, the Ukrainians, and control 1,150 square kilometers. There's a claim that they gained to a depth of 1.5 kilometers yesterday. So I that would be quite good down on the eastern front. If you gained 1.5 kilometers in a day, that's really good. I don't know whether our expectations are skewed because this is quite a lightning offensive to begin with, but still 1.5 kilometers. Let's see how far that is. If they were to go 1.5 kilometers up this road, then in a day they would be going sort of a bit further than that, right? So you can see that 1.5 kilometers isn't a huge amount. Um, uh, I don't know whether that is actually underselling what they have achieved, but I guess we'll see, because that's, at the moment that looks, if you talk about consolidation there, that's an 8.25 kilometer consolidation that took place since Andrew's last mapping, and he's doing this on a daily basis. So, yeah, I don't know what to make of the claims of kilometers, but Syrskyi hasn't mentioned it there, but elsewhere it's the claim was 1.5 kilometers. Zelensky's confirmed the full capture of Sudzha himself. He's claimed that. So that is, remember, this town here, but it's whether Sudzha, I mean, that's Sudzha itself. It's whether these areas around can still be declared as Sudzha. But that's Zelensky making some claims. And then the Bild, this is a German tabloid, says that Ukrainian forces advanced 3 kilometers east of Sudzha in Russia's Kursk region. The villages of Myrna, Bondarivka, and Mikhailivka are now under Ukrainian control. So that's a pretty decent gain, as according to the Bild. Right, let's go and have a little bit more. I don't know if we need to look at the map anymore there. Yeah, you got Martinovka there. So actually, this is to declare that where do we have it? Martinovka is not under control of the Ukrainians, whereas Andrew Perpetua has that there. And further to the south is Mikhailivka, which is there, I think. But anyway, you're going to have different interpretations from the different mappers, right? Andrew Perpetua says it has a little bit of not quite a rant, but a pointed comment. I too remember the scare quotes analysts who boldly claimed Ukraine stopped advancing, relying entirely on FSB propaganda to form their opinion. And then those same people, in their own defense, said it was amateurish to use actual evidence because that isn't analysis. And yet, a week later, Ukraine continues to advance into Russia, bringing artillery to areas that some people still believe to be Russian controlled, to fire upon areas that many think are still far behind the front. In other words, he's having to go at people that were downplaying the Ukrainian success here. Now, you've got to remember, Andrew Perpetua is not the most upbeat for the Ukrainians. He's been accused in the past of being a doom poster. He's just, I think, realistic, right? And he doesn't want to fool himself when things are going well to try and oversell that or try and cope when things are going badly. He's just like, this is how it is. But he was frustrated that people were not accepting the successes of the Ukrainians here. Now, it's interesting that people like David Sachs, who's this Elon Musk's best mate, who's a massive pro-Russian shill, was just before the attack, and he hasn't posted on Ukraine since then, since August the 2nd, I think, or something. He was banging on about how, it's all over. He'd reposted a Squatson's, an Aiden, who's a Russian, like a complete Russian troll. He'd reposted like a claim that it was all over for the Ukrainians. This was, they're in their death throes, and then like the next day, this happened. And he hasn't said anything since then. So, not that I would call him an analyst, but, there are certain people who who I don't think were ready to accept that the Ukrainians had done a good job of this. Now, the question is, of course, like we keep saying, is okay, what now, or where next? They keep advancing and keep taking territory. Okay, good, that's all great, and you're doing that with not huge costs, so this is fairly decent. But what's your end goal? Are you going to hold on to this, and what will it take to hold on to this? And by holding on to this land, will you then be having your forces attrited at levels that don't justify holding on to that land? But yeah, so just going to Koronova, this is no reports saying that Russian sources confirmed that the Ukrainians are bypassing Koronova from the west, and that battles in Krasno Tiaborskoye, southwest of Koronova, are happening. So they are trying to potentially bypass that larger town. But there were claims yesterday that we're fighting in there. You've had a T-80 BVM captured in Kursk by the Ukrainians. Ukraine is also using a T-90 tank that they have captured off the Russians, and they are using that on the front line there now. Claims of another settlement, Goncharovka, being under Ukrainian control. No Reports has a daily update that's worth following on Kursk. Lots more Russian POWs captured. Ukraine and Russia in negotiations on a prisoner exchange, according to the Financial Times. Additionally, an analyst mentioned over 2,000 soldiers have been captured. And look, there's another bit of video footage of just huge numbers of Russian POWs being captured. And then there's also footage of this is quite important. I think I've got this coming later, actually. But there were claims that Kursk was not properly fortified, but actually the Ukrainians have come across some really extensively well fortified trench lines and tunnels with toilets and everything, and this is all properly dug out, which goes against the narrative that the Russians were caught off guard because there are no fortifications. Well, actually, there are fortifications, and one would assume the Ukrainians can now use those fortifications if they are in a decent enough place for them. It depends where they are and how far they go. There's also a claim about a bridge that's been hammered by HIMARS or similar by multiple launch rockets. Although these aren't the right, and you can see these aren't the right pieces of ordnance to take out bridges, because they just cause holes in the bridge rather than give any real structural damage to the bridge. But there are claims that actually this renders the bridge unusable for heavy traffic. So here you see the holes caused by HIMARS. So that's not great, and I wouldn't like to drive over that with a heavy cargo laden truck. Nonetheless, the Ukrainians are working on hammering logistics there. I don't know if there's anything else particularly worth mentioning in his thread. Zelensky's obviously meeting very frequently. I talked about how Biden would be meeting for 4 to 5 hours. No, I got that wrong, as someone pointed out. It's every 4 to 5 hours he's getting an update on what's going on in Kursk. So the Americans are keeping a close eye on this. Here was a part about 1 point. He added today that the Ukrainians advanced 1.5 kilometers. So that doesn't sound very much. But anyway, we'll come to talk about that in a second. Just seeing. No. Okay. Right. So we'll go on. This is Tim White saying, obviously in February 2022, it was always part of Putin's great strategic master plan to be digging trenches inside Russia almost 2.5 years later. So this is BBC reporting that using satellite imagery, BBC Verify, which is a fact-checking arm of the BBC, has identified 5 locations in Kursk region where Russia appears to be rapidly digging trench lines. This is obviously panic time for the Russians. I mean, I won't go into it in any kind of detail, but they are. Let's actually go a little bit further back to see how far back these are being built.
Troops have reportedly advanced into Russia over the past week. The furthest we have observed Ukrainian troops within the Kursk region is here, more than 28 kilometers, that's 17 miles from the border. Using satellite imagery, we have also been able to identify 5 locations where Russia appears to be rapidly digging a network of trench lines. And we know these are new because the structures only began to appear in the days after Ukraine crossed into the Kursk region last Tuesday. For instance, take a look at this satellite imagery from the day when the incursion started.
Okay, so the point being, as far as I'm concerned, is that these trenches are being built really quite far back from where the Ukrainians are at the moment. That's what's going to be expected. You're not going to build trench lines right next to the contact line because you just get your excavators blown up. And it's a bit like what happened when Avdiivka fell, and the Ukrainians were feverishly building trenches, these fortifications much closer to Pokrovsk, and that's where they're retreating to at the moment. So the Russians are going to be building them much further back than they'd ideally like them to be, and that gives Ukraine the ability to take that territory from where they are now up to those fortifications realistically. So we'll have to see, and it'll be fortifications like these ones that you see that we've had a look at already. Yeah, as Euromaidan press says, this video indirectly disproves Russian claims that Ukrainian forces broke through the border due to inadequate defences, suggesting these claims were merely excuses. Okay, now we have heard that the Challenger 2 tanks are being used. Sky News has done a big report on this, being used in the Kursk operation, which would be one of the first times we've seen them in proper operational use. There was one that was lost in the Malatok-Machka kind of area during the counteroffensive, the Ukrainian counteroffensive last May, and then we stopped seeing them being used. They didn't want to use and lose the new tanks that they got from the West. It appears that they're being used up in Kursk. That's a claim. There was a claim yesterday of one Challenger 2 getting blown up, but it was a really dubious claim. And I did see one fact checker, OSINT fact checker, look at it and say, no, it wasn't. Maybe it was, I don't know. So they might have lost a Challenger 2, but I didn't talk about it because I didn't think the claim was robust enough to warrant that. Although I've just talked about it now. I've already gone through that, the refuseniks. Okay. So, actually, I did want to talk about that. That was an accident to have got rid of that. This is from Rob Lee, who says here that given that Ukraine has pulled units from Pokrovsk, Toretsk, and Chasiv Yar fronts, so Ukraine, we're talking about Ukrainians pulling units from their own front line to do this Kursk attack, the most difficult parts of their own front line, it is pretty clear that Ukraine is not pursuing limited objectives in the Kursk operation. So, this is Rob Lee's speculation, but I think you can be fairly sound, you can be fairly justified in thinking that the Ukrainians are doing this. This is a proper engagement here. This is a proper project. They aren't just, it's not just pure opportunism. That this is a really serious attack, and it's been going on for some time now. But that they have used troops from these different areas does mean that this is serious, right? Ukraine has established a first military commandant on the territory of Kursk, Oblast of Russia, quote, to maintain law and order and ensure the priority needs of the population. Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Syrskyi, is informed. Wow. So where the Russians are complaining in Kursk that they have not had any law and order, that they've been abandoned, that Russia doesn't care about them, you've now got the Ukrainian military coming in and saying, and treating the POWs well, and supposedly going through towns and treating the residents well, and trying to put power back for them, and even the internet, although I think it's to show them Ukrainian stuff. This is a very interesting bit of, I guess, propaganda, information war, but also this is part of the strategy, which is we're not the bad guys here. Yeah, we're invading you, but look what you guys have done here. We'll treat you well. You guys haven't treated us well. Yeah. So Major General Eduard Moskalyov has been appointed as the head of the commandant's office there. Right, Intel Schizo says Ukraine's Kursk 2024 operation has effectively degraded Russian near-front GLOT, ground lines of communication, Russian logistics. I talked about the rail. He does as well. The Russian counterattack will have two main logistical depots to support the eventual counterattack, being Kursk and Belgorod, with RZD and ZHV bringing supplies in by rail. Should the Russians deem Kursk and Belgorod no longer safe, then secondary hubs are Oriol and Voronezh, and Stary Oskol can be used. Once supplies come in by rail, they will be offloaded and sent to likely Russian staging points, red stars. So let's put that next to where we're talking here. So these are the staging points, red stars there. So coming in from these different directions, Voronezh, Oriol up there. Anyway, where was I? At Rilsk, Lugov, Chermonoshoy, Selikovki Fori, and Oboyan, and Rakitno by the MTO brigades by truck. The most optimal routes for the MTO brigades to transport material from the rail yards to Russian troops within 45 miles are highlighted in green. So these are your road logistics. You've got your rail logistics in orange, your road logistics there. Secondary routes for the MTO to take that will be able to bring a third less supplies a day are highlighted as thick yellow lines. So if you don't want to get if you don't want to use these routes, if you want to use by road these routes, maybe if the rail gets done in, then you'll have to take less, and you could do that as a secondary route. Third route option and least preferred would be able to bring in 2/3 less supplies per day, is highlighted in dark orange. Actually, so no, these aren't the dark orange is the road routes that aren't railway. So point being is that here you've got OSINT guy who's mapped out the logistics for the Russians. The Ukrainians would have done this. Now I'll be thinking, I'm sure, because we've heard that there have been these although I heard nothing last night, but the last few nights, Kursk has been attacked by a number of drones. Now, they're going to be looking at air bases, of course, but rest assured, surely they're going to be striking railway depots and railway logistics and taking out bridges. You want to take out bridges rather than railways because you can fix railway tracks relatively easily, bridges less so, and obviously the stations themselves and whatnot. But yeah, you know the logistic routes, and your drone operators are going to be concentrating on maps like this and targets like these all the time at the moment. Anyway, Preston Stewart says Ukrainian tactics in Kursk, according to Russian mill blogger Two Majors. He says that Ukraine knows the mixed nature of forces attempting to stop them, and they're taking advantage of that. Small groups push into areas between Russian formations, make their presence known, and wait to see how Russia responds. If Russia sends in a large force, the Ukrainians withdraw or shift left or right to avoid a major confrontation and test out a new axis of advance. However, if few or no Russian forces respond, they move a reserve element forward to further defend this new terrain. In essence, the Ukrainians continue probing for gaps. When they find one, they're exploited, and we see forward progress by Ukrainian forces. Two Majors says this is a problem as there are communications issues between Russian units. We've heard about this before. At the edges of Russian units or communication between the units, you have issues. If two different units are working, then they don't seem to cohere very well, and through those gaps, maybe is where the Ukrainians are taking advantage. There are these communication issues between Russian units, and it's not always clear who is responding to the nearest threat and with what capabilities. This has allowed Ukraine to continue advancing even as more Russian forces deployed to Kursk. So interesting stuff there. And here we have Mick Ryan, again, the retired Australian general, giving his update on what's going on. Ukraine is continuing to push forward in Kursk while also conducting a difficult defensive campaign in Donbass. On the Russian side, the Russians are continuing to push on their main effort, the advance towards Pokrovsk, while seeking to redeploy forces from other areas to stem the advance of the Ukrainians in Kursk. Both sides are moving forward while at the same time sustaining terrible damage elsewhere. The remainder of this year and possibly the trajectory of the war will be determined by who blinks first and decides that focusing on the losses they are sustaining is more important than the gains they are making elsewhere. This is the ultimate expression of Clausewitz's battle of wills. However, something else caught my eye today that in the reporting about the Kursk operation has been overlooked. In the video released in the past 24 hours, Zelensky used the following words: "It's important that Ukraine fights by the rules." That is very important in war generally, but it's also crucial for Ukraine. There are strategic, diplomatic, and moral reasons for Ukraine to fight by the rules, and it has a direct impact on Ukraine's ongoing operation in the Kursk Oblast. Now, interesting that we've also heard that maybe there are some elements wearing Russian uniforms. Is that perfidy, fighting by the rules? Okay, it's one of the less problematic issues, but still. Since the Russian large-scale invasion in February 2022, Ukraine has fought a defensive war within the bounds of international law. It has incorporated just war theory into its military strategy. At the same time, Ukraine has brought to light where the Russian military and government have transgressed international law. The Russians, who have also acted in shockingly brutal ways towards civilians, Ukrainian prisoners of war, as well as important cultural sites, have not made any significant efforts to comply with international law in the conduct of the special military operation. It is one of the key asymmetries in this war. I would agree with that. that, notwithstanding what I've just talking about. Like in general, the Ukrainians have been doing things by the book. The Russians haven't. Multiple OSCE reports have highlighted the full range of Russian war crimes. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for Russia's President Putin, as well as military leaders like Gerasimov. The Office of the Ukrainian Prosecutor General has over 120,000 open war crimes cases against Russian personnel. In the aggregate, these represent a systemic approach to the brutalization of the Ukrainian people, the destruction of their cities and cultural sites, and the callous disregard for international law and the laws of war by Russia. The Russian behavior has also served to highlight the differences in how Russians and Ukrainians see war and how they fight. Russia uses nearly every means at its disposal, legal and illegal, moral and immoral. Ukraine does not. What does this mean for the Kursk operation? People serving in the military have the lawful capacity to plan and execute operations to kill other humans. It is an important part of soldiering. However, the flip side of this lawful capacity is that it must be exercised responsibly and in a proportionate way. This is not just a principle in international law, it's also the expectation of citizens in democracies. They expect that their military personnel, despite the terrible things they must often do in war, reflect the values of the society they are drawn from and that they represent. And it's not just about representing the values of a society, ensuring that military personnel act lawfully and ethically, and these are two different things, is crucial to the projection of strategic legitimacy of a nation at war. When military personnel act professionally, they enhance the legitimacy of their nation and the cause they fight for. Of course, this then leads on to national allies better supporting them. If you're going to break the law and do terrible things, you're less likely to get support from allies. The national reputation that Ukraine has built during the war, here he says, through the projection of legitimacy has helped the operation in Kursk because Ukraine is seen as pursuing a legitimate cause, throwing Russia out of Ukraine, and Russia is not. The incursion into Kursk has not received any significant criticism from its key supporters. Ukrainians in Kursk are not fighting to expand the size of the Ukrainian state. They're conducting an operation to coerce the Russians into drawing forces away from the Donbass and to convince Russia that it cannot win this war. Fighting by the rules, as Zelensky describes it, is an important strategic enabler for Ukrainian military operations at home and in Russia. A final element of fighting by the rules should be emphasized. Those who fight for legitimate purposes and exercise force in an ethical way are better protected from moral harm. By adopting a just war approach as part of its military strategy and by fighting by the rules, the Ukrainian state is also protecting the souls of the soldiers who are fighting, and that matters. Clausewitz understood that the moral forces in war are crucial for deciding the outcome. He writes in chapter 5 of book 3 of On War that, quote, the military virtue of an army is one of the most important moral powers in war. I think the Ukrainians understand this and that to the greatest extent possible appear to have practiced being a virtuous military during this war. It is standing them in good stead as their soldiers defend against the Russian advances on the Donbass and continue their advance through Western Russia. Interesting analysis there. Chris Owicki says the Russian publication Interesting Stories has published a lengthy interview with a former Russian army officer who opposed the invasion of Ukraine. He explains how the Ukrainians were able to invade the Kursk region so easily. Here are some extracts. The former officer comments that the Russian Volunteer Corps and Freedom of Russia Legion began mounting raids into the Kursk region in March 2024. This was done to observe, quote, how quickly they respond to your arrival, how many forces there are, where, what, and how. This is vital, right? We just thought those raids were like those guys having a bit of a laugh, just causing a problem, getting the Russians to put resources up there that weren't already there. But actually, it could well have been a massive intelligence gathering operation. Not so much shaping the area, but finding out whether an attack into Kursk was a viable option. While the Ukrainians were gathering intelligence on the ground, the officer said the Russians didn't react. What changed on our side, he says, on the border in 6 months? Effing nothing. And when all these raids on the Kursk direction started, the border guards only had light firearms, no heavy equipment, and the border was practically always open. But nothing changed in 6 months. Authorities allocated money to strengthen the border. Dragon's Teeth trenches were supposedly dug, but mostly the money, as usual, was effed up, i.e. stolen. Those on the border knew something was up, he says, but were brushed off by the general command. Quote, as usual, all requests up the chain were met with, we have everything under control. Intelligence reports that nothing has been noticed. When the Ukrainians began their offensive, quote, they arrived in groups and just started pushing forward without securing positions, just further and further, one swift push, because if they were to secure positions, it would give us more time and opportunities to bring the troops to stop them. So they just push forward as fast as possible while ours are talking shit, arguing, showing up and filming reports. As they say in the army, if you want to defeat Russia, declare war and it will F itself up with inspections. End quote. The main Ukrainian force has been preceded by a screening force of long-range sabotage and reconnaissance groups, DRGs, deep reconnaissance groups, which go even further and start digging in. And when the Russian troops finally show up, the DRGs start attacking them. In this situation, quote, in this situation, our forces didn't just respond late; they didn't respond properly at all. They'd surrender and hold packs because, firstly, the conscripts don't know how to fight, and secondly, they don't have the weapons to repel such attacks. End quote. The former officer says that the Ukrainian offensive has been aided by catastrophically poor Russian command decisions, such as the sending of hundreds of troops in a convoy that was obliterated by HIMARS strikes at Rilsk on the night of 9th of August. Quote, at least on the front line, after some time and massive losses, they figured out that driving in a convoy is suicide, but those sitting there here still driving convoys and still think they're going to a parade. The AFU has drones, has rockets. What kind of effing idiot would lead a convoy in this case, and one that's even being filmed for the news? That's why the guys died without even getting there. End quote. He doubts that the Ukrainians will go much further into Russia as the line of the breakthrough is small and there is a significant risk of encirclement. Quote, as soon as our forces start doing something right and pull in reserves, they can block the airfield approaches from Ukraine. The Russian army will encircle them, stop the flow of resources, then just tighten the ring and destroy them all. End quote. As for the local civilians, a former officer believes they will be written off by the Russian authorities. Quote, since this is Russia, we don't give an F about the civilians left there. It's already clear that the locals have been abandoned to fend for themselves. People there are on their own. They'll level everything with artillery and aviation. After all, what is Kursk Oblast compared to Russia? Wow. And there you go. That was an interesting synopsis. There you go. That's my understanding of what's going on. They're pushing in these different directions still, just trying to push and push until they meet significant enough resistance, and then I guess stop. They'll have some objectives in mind. I presume Koronevo is one of them, but I don't know whether Lugov and Rilsk, as much larger hubs, are seriously on the cards, but we shall see. You've got Obiyan over here. That's another one of those staging points that was mentioned earlier. We'll see how far the Ukrainians push. It, of course, like I talked about, like as waves go out in concentric circles, that same amount of energy gets spread over a longer and longer distance, so the waves get smaller and smaller. Well, that's exactly what's going to be happening here. The larger the front line becomes, the weaker the Ukrainian forces will be along those frontline areas. So the more success you have, the weaker you eventually become. So there's a bit of a dilemma there. There's a bit of a paradox in that. The more successful you are, kind of the less successful you might become, because you can be punched back more easily. So then the Ukrainians will need to be careful of that, and they won't want to be encircled, and they want to keep their logistics in order. So be interesting to see where they go. Right, okay, that's enough. We'll stop here. Thank you very much. Anyway, I know that now's the time for me to stop here. So thank you very much. Take care. Speak soon.